All right, so a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the reporting from Seymour Hersh that was essentially alleging that the United States, along with some of our allies, were directly involved in the blowing up of the Nord Stream pipelines, essentially in an effort to reduce some of the leverage that Vladimir Putin has over Western Europe, particularly Germany, as his ongoing invasion in Ukraine continues. And we have an update here from the New York Times, basically in some sense trying to refute some of the reporting from Seymour Hersh coming directly out of the US intelligence community. So, here from the New York Times, they say intelligence suggests pro-Ukrainian group sabotaged the pipelines, U.S. officials say. Now, this reporting is kind of wild for a number of different reasons. Number one, because basically from the beginning of this, when the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, there were only like a couple different state actors who could theoretically have pulled something like this off, right? You have Russia as a potential option, which was immediately what the Ukrainians and even some U.S. politicians tried to basically come out and allege at the beginning, that Russia did this, they blew up their own pipeline. That didn't really seem to make much sense. They definitely have the technical capabilities to pull something like that off, but it didn't really align with their motivations in this war. Again, that being a key leverage point for them over Western Europe and their energy supply. And then the other option, or options that you would have, would be the United States, either our intelligence community, our State Department, working in coordination with some of our allies, maybe potentially the Ukrainians, maybe some other countries as well, in order to try to blow this up, right? There's only a few countries who could logistically pull an operation like this off. And so given the fact that it didn't really align with Russia's motivations in their invasion of Ukraine, it seemed like the most likely actor was probably the United States, along with some of our allies, and maybe, of course, including Ukrainians, right? But they're alleging in this piece that it was not the United States, that in fact the United States had absolutely no involvement whatsoever, and that also the government of Ukraine had no, responsibility in this whatsoever either. Okay, so essentially the allegations they're going to make is that this was some sort of combination of maybe Russian nationalists who are anti-Putin and maybe some Ukrainian sort of like rogue agents who are going and doing this operation with no outside input from the United States, any of our intelligence communities or anything like that, right? Okay, so this is kind of wild reporting here because it seems like at surface level, if you understand how difficult this type of an operation would be to pull off, it seems kind of unlikely that a non-state actor would have been able to do this logistically and then get away with it after the fact. Okay, so here from the New York Times. They say new intelligence reviewed by U.S. officials suggests that a pro-Ukrainian group carried out the attack on the Nord Stream pipelines last year, a step toward determining responsibility for an act of sabotage that has confounded investigators on both sides of the Atlantic for months. They say U.S. officials said that they had no evidence that President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine or his top lieutenants were involved in the operation, or that the perpetrators were acting at the direction of any Ukrainian government officials. Okay, so they're saying, again, these were basically, I guess, rogue Ukrainians who were able to go pull off this highly technical, deep sea diving mission where they planted C4 on the Nord Stream pipelines, did this without anybody noticing in the middle of one of these massive, military exercises, the Baltrops or a Baltops 22 that was going on at the time. And they managed to do this by themselves with no knowledge from the Ukrainian government and with no knowledge from the US government or any other governments within Western Europe. Okay, that's the claim that they're trying to get us to believe here. Now, they continue saying that Ukraine and its allies have been seen by some officials as having the most logical potential motive to attack the pipelines. They have opposed the project for years, calling it a national security threat because it would allow Russia to sell gas more easily to Europe. Okay, that part of it is true. It definitely would allow Russia to sell more gas easily to Europe. Ukrainian government and military intelligence officials say that they had no role in the attack and do not know who carried it out. Okay, so I guess we just would walk away from this, right? Because they say they didn't do it, so I guess they had no knowledge of it, right? I mean, again, it's kind of ridiculous at face value, but they say U.S. officials said that there was much they did not know about the perpetrators and their affiliations. The review of newly collected intelligence suggests that they were opponents of President Vladimir Putin of Russia, but does not specify the members of the group or who directed or paid for the operation. Okay, so I would like to know a little bit more about this intelligence that they're gathering, right? Somehow you know that these were Ukrainians or at least pro-Ukrainian saboteurs who were involved in this, but you don't know who was paying for the operation, who was directing the operation, who were the members of the group. I mean, it seems like you got some gaps here in this, so-called intelligence report, but they say U.S. officials declined to disclose the nature of the intelligence, how it was obtained, or any details of the strength of the evidence it contains. Okay, so they're basically telling us nothing, okay? And they say they have said that there are no firm conclusions about it, leaving open the possibility that the operation may have been conducted off the books by a proxy force with connections to the Ukrainian government or its security services. Okay, so that's something I would be more inclined to believe, right? That seems a little bit more likely. Maybe they, weren't doing this directly at the upper echelons within the Ukrainian government or, something like that, but they use sort of a proxy to try to cover their tracks a little bit. That would make a little bit more sense, right? But they say officials who have reviewed the intelligence said that they believe the saboteurs were most likely Ukrainian or Russian nationals or some combination of the two. U.S. officials said that no American or British nationals were involved. Okay, I'm sure that's true. They say the pipelines were ripped apart by deep sea explosions in September in what U.S. officials described at the time as an act of sabotage. European officials have publicly said that they believe the operation that targeted Nord Stream was probably state-sponsored, possibly because of the sophistication in which the perpetrators planted and detonated the explosives on the floor of the Baltic Sea without being detected. Okay, so again, it seems pretty unlikely, given the nature of the operation, that this could have possibly been without state involvement. Okay, so again, then the follow-up question to that is there's only so many state actors who could potentially be behind this. Okay, you have Ukraine, and maybe believing that Ukrainian government officials were involved in this at some level one way or another, and maybe they were acting unilaterally with no input from any of the other, proxies who are funding this ongoing war in Ukraine and supporting the Ukrainian defensive efforts. I find that kind of hard to believe. I would think that this would most likely be more so at the direction, or at least with the assistance, of some other country in Western Europe or the United States. But they continue here saying that U.S. officials have not stated publicly that they believe the operation was sponsored by a state, which again doesn't really make much sense, but they say the explosives were most likely planted with the help of experienced divers who did not appear to be working for military or intelligence services. U.S. officials who have reviewed the new intelligence said, okay, so where are these divers coming from? They're just like freelance divers who just go and do these massively consequential acts of terrorism and blowing up a NATO ally's pipelines, just like at the direction of whoever, right? I mean, again, it's kind of funny to just suggest that these are just like random people who have no affiliation with any intelligence services around the world, definitely not here in the United States, right? But they say it is possible that the perpetrators received specialized government training in the past. Okay, by whose government? What type of training are you talking about here? I mean, this kind of seems like it's in response to part of the first part of Seymour Hersh's reporting, alleging that the United States, through our covert operations, was leading the charge in trying to get these pipelines blown up. And the first thing that they talk about here, I mean, literally in paragraph 1 and 2, is about this facility in Florida where our, government was using this to train a lot of highly skilled divers at this facility in the United States. Okay, so it seems like that may be what they're talking about here, kind of, I guess, leaving up the potential that, okay, maybe down the line we might have to admit that some of these divers received training, at this U.S. facility, right? Which would obviously lend credence to the idea that we had more involvement in this that they are letting on here. But they continue saying that early last year, President Biden, and again, this was part of Seymour Hersh's reporting here that they're lifting, but they say after meeting with Chancellor Olaf Scholz of Germany at the White House, said that Mr. Putin's decision about whether to attack Ukraine would determine the fate of Nord Stream 2. He said, quote, this is directly from Biden, if Russia invades, that means tanks and troops crossing the border of Ukraine again, then there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it. And then, when he was asked a follow-up question on this, he cryptically said, I promise you, we'll be able to do it. Okay, and I covered this on the channel in the last video that we talked about the Nord Stream 2 being blown up in Seymour Hersh's reporting. You had, I think it was a German reporter who was asking him basically like, well, listen, man, you're saying that you're going to end the Nord Stream 2 pipeline regardless, right? But this isn't your pipeline. This is a pipeline that goes from Russia to Germany. So shouldn't it be up to the German people what the fate of this pipeline is? And he basically just responded by saying like, wink and a nod, we'll figure out a way to stop this project one way or another. But They finish off here saying that any findings that put blame on Kyiv or Ukrainian proxies could prompt a backlash in Europe and make it harder for the West to maintain a united front in support of Ukraine. I mean, yeah, if I was a German, right, if I was a German citizen or a member of the German government, probably wouldn't be too happy that this government that you are, funding and supporting and their ongoing defense against the Russians would, commit an act of terrorism against you, a NATO country, right, which also opens up a whole bunch of other, possibilities about the NATO treaty and stuff like that, because it's like, okay, well, if Ukraine attacked a NATO partner and a NATO ally, Ukraine is not part of NATO. They committed an act of terrorism against, this pipeline that was being built, civilian infrastructure, right? Kind of opens up some other questions about NATO's involvement with Ukraine. But they say U.S. officials and intelligence agencies acknowledge that they have limited visibility into Ukrainian decision making. So this is another problem that I've been talking about since the beginning of this war. But they say despite Ukraine's deep dependence on the United States for military, intelligence, and diplomatic support, Ukrainian officials are not always transparent with their American counterparts about their military operations, especially those against Russian targets behind enemy lines. Those operations have frustrated U.S. officials who believe that they have not measurably improved Ukraine's position on the battlefield, but have risked alienating European allies and widening the war. Okay, so this is a very important part of this. Obviously, again, if we do get conclusive, confirmation from one of these investigations that it was Ukrainians who were responsible with some input from the Ukrainian government for blowing up the pipelines, yeah, that's going to have some reverberating effects on the, alliance that is supporting Ukraine in this. But on top of that, we also have lots of new polling data coming out of the United States indicating that especially Republicans are starting to turn against continuing the aid to Ukraine, right? And then on top of all of those things as well, I mean, you have all of these different things that Ukraine has done recently, whether it's blowing up the Crimean bridge or targeting Dugin's daughter in Russian territory and all of these other moves, including potentially blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. Well, that has a lot of other open questions about exactly what are you guys doing in order to try to potentially escalate this war or drag the United States into this war. Now, listen, it's one thing to say that, okay, you're in a war situation. Ukrainians, of course, they're going to take every measure possible, including maybe trying to kill Russians within Russia or blowing up the Crimean bridge or doing all of this and that. That's just a part of war. They're trying to defend their territory and all this and that. That's fine if you want to talk about that from the perspective of the Ukrainians, but this isn't a war that is just being fought by the Ukrainians, right? Obviously, they're the ones doing the fighting on the front lines, but we are essentially propping up the entirety of the Ukrainian economy, the entirety of the Ukrainian military. And so if the Ukrainian government is trying to take actions basically that are escalatory, that are going to increase the likelihood of the United States having to get directly involved with a hot war against the against the Russians, well, then that is something that we should also have a say in, right? I mean, that's not something you just leave up in the air and say, okay, well, you guys can do whatever the fuck you want with our weapons. No, we don't want to start World War III, so that also has to be a factor. And so that brings up other questions about how kind of alarming it is that we have, this partner in this ongoing proxy war against Russia, and we don't even know a lot of the action that they are taking. They're not giving us warning about this. They're not being completely forthcoming or honest about some of the actions that they've been taking as a part of this war. That's pretty fucked up, right? I mean, we should at least, if we're going to be supporting the entirety of the Ukrainian military and propping it up and sending them all of these weapons and billions of dollars in aid, we should at least know what exactly they're doing with that. What exactly are the red lines that they're walking up to or potentially crossing, right? That would be a kind of an important part of this conversation, right? But they continue saying that the operations that have unnerved the United States included an early strike again in August on Russia's Saki air base on the western coast of Crimea, a truck bombing in October that destroyed part of the Kerch Strait Bridge, which links Russia to Crimea, and drone strikes in December aimed at Russian military bases in Ryazan and Engels, about 300 miles beyond the Ukrainian border. But there have been other acts of sabotage and violence of more ambiguous provenance that U.S. intelligence agencies have had a harder time attributing directly to Ukrainian security services. One of those was a car bomb near Moscow in August that killed Daria Dugina, the daughter of a prominent Russian nationalist, and Kyiv denied any involvement, but U.S. intelligence agencies eventually came to believe that the killing was authorized by what officials called elements in the Ukrainian government, kind of vague there. And in response to the finding, the Biden administration privately rebuked the Ukrainians and warned them against taking similar actions. The explosions that ruptured the Nord Stream pipelines took place 5 weeks after Mrs. Dugina's killing. After the Nord Stream operation, there was hushed speculation and worry in Washington that parts of the Ukrainian government may may have been involved in that operation as well. Okay, so listen. My general takeaway from this is that, number one, I think it's kind of absurd to suggest that if you were going to make the claim that these were Ukrainian saboteurs, that they didn't have, any sort of knowledge at the upper echelons of the Ukrainian government. That seems pretty far-fetched to me, again, just given the complicated nature of this type of an operation, how logistically difficult it was to pull off, how it was happening at the same time that there was this massive military exercise in the Baltic Sea. That seems like it would be a pretty good cover that the United States may have something to do with, but on top of that, just being logistically extremely difficult for some, non-affiliated, non-state actors to pull off this type of an operation, you also have, of course, the previous statements from Joe Biden, where he, openly said we are going to shut down this pipeline, get it stopped no matter what it takes, right? And then on top of that, you also just have the interests in terms of who would benefit from blowing up this pipeline, aligning perfectly with the United States. I mean, if you guys remember, back right after the pipeline was blown up, we had state officials like, I think it was Anthony Blinken at the time, who was coming out and basically saying like, well, we didn't have anything to do with this, but at the same time, this is a really great thing that just happened, right? This is going to be super beneficial to the United States and our global objectives. So, I mean, listen, this is your current update on, the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine. Obviously, you feel for the Ukrainians, right? Nobody, at least I hope in my community, is supportive of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but, it's an entirely different conversation to be talking about committing acts of like massive industrial sabotage and terrorism against other NATO allies as we are continuing to prop up this war effort. As we know, based on previous reporting, that the United States, some of our allies, have sabotaged previous attempts to push for negotiation and diplomacy, and continuing to have a situation where this seems like it's just going to continue escalating, because if you are able and willing to blow up the Nord Stream pipeline, if you're Ukraine, well, then that obviously begs the question of like, well, how far are you going to go to potentially rope the United States into this war? And if the United States, which I think is the most likely outcome, was directly involved in sabotaging the Nord Stream pipeline, well then again, how far is our own government willing to take us up to that red line and risk potential nuclear, World War III popping off in order to continue this proxy war, which at the end of the day is, of course, just being fought for economic, geopolitical reasons, and the United States is just trying to use this as an opportunity in order to weaken our political adversary in Russia, in Vladimir Putin.
Everyone is saying good Politic guy has the best Politic. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying